In their teenage years, Ravel and his close friend Ricardo Viñes shared an enthusiasm for the stories of Edgar Allan Poe. As Viñes writes in his diary, August 1892, Wednesday the 10th, after lunch I went to Ravel's. Maurice showed me a very gloomy drawing he has done for a descent into Edgar Poe's Maelstrom. When I was there today, he did another one, also very black, for Poe's manuscript found in a bottle. Ravel was clearly drawn to the Gothic imagery of Poe's tales. Nevertheless, he would never write any music that drew direct inspiration from them. Around the year 1896, Viñes introduced Ravel to Gaspard de la Nuit, a small volume of prose poems by Aloysius Bertrand, a contemporary of Edgar Allan Poe who displayed a similar predilection for the bizarre, the mysterious, and the diabolical. This was how Bertrand's older brother describes him. Surrendering to childish illusions, he welcomed strange voices coming to him late in the night, the rush of wind in great trees, the cry of a gull or that of a lost dog, echoing in the distance, stirred within him the ivories of an unknown keyboard. Bertrand's Gaspard de la Nuit was published posthumously in 1842 and subsequently fell into obscurity. It was through the efforts of Charles Baudelaire that these poems became more widely known. Significantly, Baudelaire was also among the first to translate the works of Edgar Allan Poe into French, providing a source of inspiration for the French symbolist movement in the final decades of the 19th century. Given this context, it's hardly surprising that Bertrand's poems should appeal to Ravel. In an introductory story, Bertrand relates how he encountered a peculiar old man called Gaspard in a garden in Dijon. Upon recognizing that Bertrand was a poet, Gaspard launched into a lengthy philosophical discussion about the nature of art, of God, and the devil. Then Gaspard handed Bertrand a manuscript, a collection of poems which was the fruit of Gaspard's long and laborious study. He told Bertrand to read it and return it the next day. But when the time came to return the manuscript, Gaspard could not be found anywhere. As Bertrand discovered, this was because Gaspard was in hell, as Gaspard de la Nuit, or Treasurer of the Night, was in fact the devil. So this was how Bertrand came to be in possession of the collection of poems which we're supposed to believe was written by the devil himself. Ravel selected 3 poems from the collection and began working on Gaspard de la Nuit in 1908. The compositional process proved to be quite a struggle. As Ravel writes, Gaspard has been the very devil to finish, which is not surprising since he is the author of the poems. Always perfectionistic and self-critical, Ravel probably thought that only music of devilish complexity would do justice to these poems. Years later, addressing a student who was working on Gaspard de la Nuit, Ravel would make this revealing comment about Bertrand's work. It's marvelous, all the romanticism of the 19th century is found in this little old book. Let's now take a closer look at the first poem that Ravel shows. Ondine is an important figure in European folklore. According to the alchemical writings of the Swiss physician Paracelsus from the Renaissance, there are 4 elemental beings corresponding to the 4 elements: gnome, Ondine, sylph, and salamander. So Ondine is the elemental water spirit. In English, her name is often spelled with a U, which clarifies the derivation from the Latin unda, meaning wave. The word undulate also comes from the same root, reflecting Ondine's strong aquatic association. Often portrayed as a femme fatale, you can even trace Ondine's origins to the sirens in the Odyssey. And whether in the medieval tale of Melusine or Hans Christian Andersen's The Little Mermaid, the common theme is that the encounter between a mortal man and the female water spirit usually doesn't lead to a happy ending. Even today, images of the water spirit are ubiquitous, constantly enticing you to buy an expensive cup of coffee. All the poems in Gaspard de la Nuit are headed by epigraphs that are taken from various sources. For Ondine, the epigraph from a poem by Charbonneau establishes a veiled, dreamy quality. It mentions 2 key elements that are directly relevant to Ravel's Ondine: vague harmony and the murmuring song of a sad and tender voice. It's interesting to note that the encounter between Ondine and the mortal man is not direct and immediate. There seems to be a window between them. So we can imagine that she's outside in her beguiling supernatural world, while he's inside in some confined space where human reason and logic prevail. Visually, the asterisk makes this separation quite clear. Above the asterisk are the 3 verses that make up Ondine's song. Her language is evocative and spatially oriented, painting a fantastic and alluring world that seems to exist untarnished by the flow of time. In contrast, below the asterisk are the 2 verses from the man's perspective, where the tone is more matter-of-fact, emphasizing sequential progression and dispassionate cause and effect. In short, she's descriptive and he's dismissive. This is perhaps the most striking aspect of the poem. Ondine's charms prove so readily resistible, which seems to subvert the typical portrayal of the water spirit as a dangerous seductress in the literary tradition that Bertrand would have been familiar with. Bertrand's Ondine seems to be more like the Little Mermaid, perhaps somewhat naive or even puerile, but essentially benign. However, Ondine's reaction to the man's rejection raises some doubts about this interpretation. After shedding a few tears, she actually burst out laughing. What are we to make of this? Is there something sinister about it? As in, you'll pay for this, I'll have the last laugh. Or is it more like the sort of laughter that's been astutely described in the Book of Proverbs, laughter that actually conceals sorrow? Personally, I'm more inclined towards this latter interpretation, and I think that Ravel's setting is exquisitely sensitive to the implied emotional depth beneath the flowing eloquence and apparent restraint. As the French composer Roland Manuel insightfully remarks in his biography of Ravel, one must not expect from Ravel works in which feeling is continually exaggerated by the violence of its expression. One must not ask Ravel to stir the dark waters of desire or willingly to reveal the gulfs of despair. If the lake which envelops the wondrous Ondine is deep, we gauge the depth by its limpidity. In a word, Ravel's magic, inasmuch as it exists, is still white magic. Roy Howitt describes Ondine as a sonata formed by stealth. Given the poetic source of inspiration, it's not surprising that the piece seems to favor narrative continuity over structural clarity. The themes are closely related and they're recapitulated in reversed order. True to the epigraph, the piece begins with a vague harmony. A C-sharp major triad is colored by a minor sixth, which destabilizes the harmony with an augmented quality. Incidentally, Liszt did something very similar at the ends of Valet Doberman. But the rapid oscillation between the fifth and the minor sixth at the start of Ondine creates an ethereal shimmering, making it feel like the harmony exists in a no-man's land between a major triad and an augmented triad. The pattern itself is also captivating. At a glance, you can already tell that it's not a straightforward alternation. However, a repeating pattern does emerge in units of 8 30-second notes. So what we have then is a complex pattern that gives the impression of being at once constant and ever-changing. In other words, it's a fitting metaphor for the nature of water itself. Ravel told Ricardo Viñes that Ondine's song should initially be submerged in this accompanimental figuration. This remark highlights another notable feature of the opening. The melody unfolds in the same register as or below the accompanimental figuration, so it's not meant to be immediately distinct, but to gradually emerge from its aquatic abode. The voicing is also remarkable because the melody gives the seventh and ninth of the prevailing harmony, which we usually expect to hear high above the root of the chord, not in such proximity to it. In comparison, consider the opening of Jadot, where we find a more conventional voicing of a ninth chord. A Another point of contrast between the two water pieces is that, unlike the major ninth at the start of Jadot, the underlying harmony at the start of Ondine, if we ignore the A natural for the moment, is actually a dominant ninth. This would suggest that the harmonic point of departure for Ondine is not Ravel's Jadot, but rather Liszt's. So if this piece is truly in the key of C-sharp major, as the key signature would lead us to believe, then the opening obscures the tonic with both the augmented quality produced by A natural and the dominant seventh feel of B natural. Or to consider it from a different perspective, this opening actually articulates most of the B acoustic collection. Like the octatonic collection, the acoustic collection can also evoke the exotic and fantastical, so it seems an apt choice for this music. The main theme comprises 3 distinct small phrases, which we'll call A, B, and C. But when we look more closely at the construction of the melody, we find that the pitch material is derived from a single 4-note motive that spans a perfect fifth. Incidentally, if you were to loop the motive, it starts to sound very much like this music. But rather than employing the motive in a repetitive and propulsive way, Ravel plays around with the ordering of the pitches and transposes the motive. Also, the first pitch of the motive is sometimes displaced by the octave. In this way, Ravel is able to create a long, intricate melody that achieves coherence through the underlying pitch motive. In measure 10, phrase C is extended and developed. Here the melody manages to rise above the accompanimental figuration for the first time. And also for the first time, the underlying pitch motive is stretched beyond its usual span of a fifth. That is, rather than, we get the D sharp in measure 11 therefore comes across as a special pitch, which it certainly is because, after all, this was the very first note of Ondine's song. D sharp is strategically highlighted here in anticipation of the restatement of the melody at its original pitch level in measure 14, which initiates the transition. Note that the figuration tries to mirror the melody whenever possible, preparing us for the octave doubling of the melody in measure 14. The right-hand figuration here roams over 3 octaves, apparently a clever virtuosic variation of the figuration from the start of the piece. However, considering how naturally pianistic this figuration seems to be, my speculation is that Ravel was initially inspired by tactile logic at the keyboard and came up with virtuosic figurations such as this first, before deriving the opening registrally confined version from it. And happily enough, the resulting pattern turned out to be quite fascinating in its own right. In measure 16, phrase B is developed, and the plagal inclination of the preceding phrase A now finds resolution in an F-sharp dominant 13th harmony. The right-hand melody draws on pitch material from measures 4 to 5, and the left hand echoes the first and last pitches of the short right-hand phrase against the backdrop of whole tone vacillation. In measure 20, The phrase is developed through intervallic stretching, becoming most expansive in measure 22 as we reach the dominant. Against the aspiring treble line, the bass line has been arpeggiating its way downward to G sharp. This contrary motion results in the vast registral expanse at the start of measure 22. We'll label this material D. So to summarize the principal harmonies from measure 14 to measure 22 in root position, what we have is essentially this progression. Having reached the dominant, the music immediately becomes preoccupied with the dominant of the dominant. This is a conventional way of solidifying the move to the dominant. However, what follows is anything but conventional. The harmonies in measures 26 to 29 add disorienting color and make the reappearance of G sharp major in measure 30 seem more striking. After giving the impression of heading towards A sharp major, a whole tone sleight of hand takes us instead to the dominant 13th of E major, a tritone away. As we'll see, Ravel makes frequent use of tritone relations, mostly involving major or dominant harmonies. By the way, this is something that Mussorgsky employed to great effect in the famous coronation scene from his opera Boris Godunov, where A-flat-7 and D7 are a tritone apart and belong to the same octatonic collection. The subordinate theme is similar to the main theme in several ways. First, the right-hand figuration gives us a major triad that's colored by a minor sixth as before. And the melody, which is similarly presented below the accompanimental figuration, also incorporates the 7th and 9th of the chord. In fact, in measures 33 to 35, the melody becomes almost exactly the same as the melody from the extended phrase C in measures 11 to 13. So really, only the material in measure 32 is new, and we'll call it E. Note that the initial stepwise descent articulates a partial whole tone scale here. We should remember this because, at the start of the recapitulation, Ravel will allow the melody to progress through the entire whole tone scale in a moment of fervent expression. The development section begins with a curtailed version of the main theme, now presented a fifth above G sharp major. Harmonically, we can see that tritone relations play a prominent role at the local level, while longer range harmonic motions tend to favor minor thirds or augmented seconds. At the same time, Ravel is subtly introducing brief instances of surface-level chromaticism in measure 44 and the corresponding spot in measure 49, preparing us for the extended chromatic elaboration that is to come, most strikingly in measures 60 to 61. In measure 45, we hear a melody in the bass register for the first time. We'll call this material F. Perhaps it corresponds to Ondine's description of her palace in the depths of the lake, or of her father beating the croaking water. Note that the rising impetus of the melodic line is restricted for the moment, as the melody arches its way back to its starting pitch. In hindsight, you can feel that there is latent power here just waiting to emerge from the depths. For roughly the first half of the development section, we find a relatively serene alternation between the truncated main theme in the high register and phrase F in the bass. But the reappearance of the melody from the subordinate theme in measure 52 signals a turning point. It's first woven into a gossamer texture of hypnotic A pedal points. Then, in measure 55, the melody suddenly bursts out in octaves, presaging the impassioned statement that is to come at the start of the recapitulation. From measure 57 to the start of the recapitulation in measure 66, the music builds in successive waves in which phrase F seeks to realize the full potential of its rising impetus, finally achieving what is essentially one long ascending line in measures 61 to 65. Against the ascending efforts of phrase F, we initially hear cascading double notes that start out by articulating an octatonic collection before morphing into a minor scale with a sharpened fourth. More interesting, however, are the double notes in measures 60 to 61, where the lower line is mostly chromatic and the upper line is octatonic, with the exception of the initial C. This combination produces a complex kaleidoscope of colors, perhaps like the increasingly restless waters sparkling under the moonlight. In measure 62, the music grows more expansive as the rising line, reinforced as thick chords, moves in contrary motion to the bass line. At the same time, the rumbling left-hand figuration also becomes more registrally expansive. You'll notice that none of the harmonies in measures 62 to 64 shares any common tones with its neighbors, which makes the progression sound purposeful and dynamic. It's as if Ravel wanted to cover as much ground as possible, both in terms of registral space and pitch space. The overall effect is a massive buildup like a strong swelling tide. The torrential outpouring that ensues not only evokes the aquatic world in all its elemental power and majesty, it's also the most uninhibited expression of Ondine's desires. As previously mentioned, the whole tone descent that was left incomplete in measure 32 is now unleashed in full. But perhaps more remarkable is the sequential progression that Ravel uses to harmonize the whole tone descent, which can be summarized like this. The main harmonic pillars are minor ninth chords that are a major third apart and linked together by dominant 13ths. Perhaps it's symbolically significant that the emotional crux of Ondine should be a fluid symmetrical progression that could theoretically keep on flowing forever and ever. The descending melodic line and the right-hand figuration in measure 67 remind me of a passage from Liszt's Dante Sonata. as this particular passage from the Dante Sonata may in turn be inspired by the tragic love of Francesca da Rimini, I find this association richly meaningful. Of course, rather than going on and on without end, the symmetrical sequence resolves rather poignantly in measure 68. You'll recall that at the very beginning of the piece, a major triad with a minor sixth arrested our attention. But here in measure 68, like in measure 8, we essentially have the reverse, a minor triad with a major sixth. In other words, it's a yearning half-diminished seventh harmony, which is further enriched by expressive appoggiaturas. Ravel evidently found the harmony worth dwelling on, so we get to enjoy it for 4 measures, while the melody, which is a fragment from the extended phrase C, is stated 3 times, each time in a higher register. The last statement is drawn out like a futile wish that you still cling to in quiet desperation. The change in key signature and meter at the start of the transition in measure 72 seems to signal a shift in perspective, much as the asterisk does in the poem. The intensity and longing of the subordinate theme dissolve into the understated grandeur of the transition. Harmonically, we get the juxtaposition of C major and F sharp major, the same pairing that Ravel already used in Jeu d'eau. And which Stravinsky also exploited in Petrushka. But here, it's not just about juxtaposing 2 harmonies that are a tritone apart. We also get the contrast between the diatonic and the pentatonic, and, as any performer can directly experience, the contrast between white keys and black keys. To me, these contrasts represent the rift between the human realm and the supernatural realm. After all, we can infer from the verses that come after the asterisk that, from the man's perspective, human commitments and concerns are essentially incompatible with the enchanted vision of the water spirit. Ondine's song resurfaces for the last time as the main theme returns in measure 80. Even though we've heard the familiar melody many times now, this is only the second time in the piece that we hear it unfolding against the backdrop of a minor harmony. The first time was 72 measures ago. This is to be Ondine's last entreaty, and Ravel reminds us that it should be expressive. As her song fades away, the harmony drops by a tritone. We've seen that tritone relations are integral to the sonic landscape of the piece. However, this is the first and only time that minor harmonies are involved. As such, we can feel that it's an exceptional moment, one that I think conveys the pangs of sobering rejection. Then, in a simple yet masterful stroke of programmatic depiction, the melody from the extended phrase C is given unaccompanied. If this were a movie, I imagine that the camera would be zooming in on Ondine's face, looking sad and pale in the moonlight as tears roll down her cheek. For the moment, even the flowing water, which has been a constant element of the scenery up to this point, falls eerily silent. Then she suddenly bursts out laughing. Her laughter would sound a lot more ordinary if Ravel had written it as a plain faux-bourdon, a series of parallel triads in first inversion, like this. But of course, Ondine is no ordinary being, so Ravel introduces two features that completely transform her laughter. First, he adds a clashing dissonance to each triad. You could say that he turned each major triad into a dominant flat ninth harmony, which would be like this in root position. In addition, Ravel gives us a strong E-flat in the bass, which seems to come out of nowhere and dissonates against everything else. In hindsight, though, you come to realize that the E-flat is just a D-sharp that arrives too early. In fact, you could even say that E-flat is the only correct pitch here, and everything else is an extravagant embellishment, just as Ondine's laughter itself may essentially be a sort of embellishment, a forced gesture that hides her true feelings. In any case, the harmony that ultimately emerges out of her laughter is the supertonic half-diminished seventh of C-sharp major, which resolves to the tonic triad with a minor sixth in a kind of wistful plagal cadence. Harmonically, the combination of C-sharp major triad and A natural mirrors the start of the piece. Rhythmically, however, the formerly complex pattern is abandoned in favor of a more straightforward arpeggiation in both hands. In the final chord, even the A natural disappears, and we can imagine that Ondine has completely vanished into the watery depths, leaving behind no trace of her unearthly presence. Thanks for watching.